Throughout my experiences as both a game master and as a player, I've played with dozens of different individuals. Some have been following the evolution of TTRPGs since their inception, and others, like me, were introduced to the hobby through 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. No matter what our different backgrounds, though, there's one topic that inevitably comes up when it comes to D&D: optimization. Which feats, spells, and multi-class combinations are optimal, and which ones aren't? Even more hotly debated, is optimization acceptable at your table? Does it create storytelling or game balance problems? Or is it a feature at your table and everyone likes to optimize their characters? Like most topics on this channel, I don't find myself landing on one side of the fence or the other all the time, but rather find that the answer that feels right is based on the context of a particular playgroup. So rather than speaking in the abstract, today I'd like to tell you some of my actual experiences with optimization, some lessons that I learned along the way, so maybe through them we can all glean a clearer answer on whether or not optimization is right for us. Hi, I'm John. This is Dragon Mind, where we discover our best selves through gaming, and today I'm recounting 5 tales of optimization in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. Let's get into it. Back in my senior year of high school, D&D was something I really couldn't stop thinking about. I'd recently watched the Futurama movie Bender's Game, and there was one scene toward the beginning that really stuck with me. The party was fighting a dragon, and Bender went to use a fire spell, which the dragon was immune to. But rather than targeting the dragon, he targeted a pool of water to create a cloud of steam that covered the party's escape. As someone who loves video game RPGs for their storytelling, I was compelled by the idea of being able to cleverly use mechanics to come up with creative solutions that were tied into a game's narrative. Of course, aside from some disastrous attempts of running 4th edition D&D myself, I never really got a chance to play the game long term until 2016. I was an employee at a family education center, a brick and mortar business that had programming designed for families to learn and grow together. About 6 months into the center opening, one of the programs we ended up offering was 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. I was one of the first players in that program in a game run by a GM that had much more experience than I did. I'd also just completed my first run of The Witcher 3. And so for my first character, I wanted to play a Geralt of Rivia-like character, but with the creative storytelling freedom that a TTRPG allows for. When my GM and I sat down to create my character, I described the kind of abilities that I was looking for and the kind of story I was looking to tell, and what they recommended was building an Eldritch Knight fighter. Not knowing much about the game's mechanics and not having a player's handbook to read myself, I listened to the GM's description of the class and subclass, thought it was fine, and went home with my level 1 fighter. Well, as you can probably guess, I'm one that really likes to research things that I'm interested in. And again, Eldritch Knight was something I knew that I was probably going to pick at level 3, but I wanted to prepare myself for what my character would play like once I got there. So that night, I went home, Googled Eldritch Knight Play Guide, and the community consensus at the time was that Eldritch Knight was one of the weaker fighter subclasses. In my head, what I wanted my character to do was primarily fight with a longsword, but also have a little bit of magic to use for versatility. As I read the commentary surrounding Eldritch Knight and some of the mechanics for myself, what I started to realize is that Eldritch Knight actually had more spell casting than what I envisioned. As I continued to research and plan out a build for my character, I ended up making 2 discoveries. First were the rules for multi-classing, which would allow me to build a kind of custom character borrowing from levels of different classes. Second was the flavor description of the Ranger. As I read the Ranger, its options, and its flavor, to me it sounded like a better fit than the Eldritch Knight Fighter. They're deadly hunters, warriors of the wilderness. They pick a favorite enemy, monstrosities, which again, if I'm thinking I want to create a monster hunter, I just have monstrosity as my favorite enemy. And there was a favored terrain, which would make it easier for my ranger to track enemies through the wilderness, forage, do typical Witcher things. So we play for a few sessions, we get to our first level up, the warlock becomes a level 2 warlock, the bard becomes a level 2 bard, and I go from a level 1 fighter to a multi-classed level 1 fighter, level 1 ranger. And at level 3, I multi-classed again into sorcerer. Again, because to me, that one level of sorcerer gave me all the spells I wanted for versatility, but I also wouldn't need any more magic than that. Here, I thought I had hacked the system to create my ideal character. And then, as we got more and more levels, certain aspects of the game I hadn't realized became apparent to me, and it really revealed the downside to this abomination of a multi-class I had built. Rather than story first, mechanics second, I realized what I was building was a story-only character without consideration for the mechanics. And these were some of the drawbacks. First, natural explorer and favorite enemy were too situational and too specific. They never came up, and I failed in conveying my particular character's specialized training. Rather than feeling like a witcher that could expertly track through the wilderness and know a lot about monsters, I had a fighter that was a worse fighter because I had split off into levels of ranger and sorcerer. You can't even really fault the GM for not integrating my favorite enemy or favored terrain in the campaign. I had made this decision to take on a favored enemy and favored terrain midway through a story arc. It's not like he was just gonna pick up the whole game that we were playing and then set it in my favored terrain. Second, I did not understand how bad multiple ability score dependency was until I experienced it. When I first built my character, based on my GM's recommendations, my highest stat was strength, followed by constitution. Because at this point we were rolling for our stats, 4d6 dropped the lowest, I ended up with a lot of floating +1s. I had about a 13 in my other stats, which allowed me to multi-class randomly like I did. But because my character lacked an ability score focus, I just ended up really bad at a lot of skills instead of being good at a set of them. The skills I really wanted my character to be good at were nature and survival. And my sorcerer spellcasting was based off charisma. So I ended up with spells that would often fail when I tried them, and not having very high bonuses to nature or survival. Third, I had no experience and no concept with the importance of building a martial character with extra attack. When we hit 5th level, I was already starting to feel a little underpowered. And then, the party warlock, archer, and monk are all rolling for 2 attacks per round, and my character, when he could hit, didn't really have a lot of the damage bonuses that those other classes were offering those players. With this first character, my mistaken assumption was that my creative storytelling ability would make up for any mechanical gaps that I left in my build. And to my GM's credit, they often allowed me to have some creative solutions. But unlike the other players, I always felt like I was negotiating and debating with my GM, and there was always this tension in trying to let me get away with things. Whereas for the other players who were just playing single-classed characters, their characters were operating more how they expected because they were just playing by the rules in the handbook. The biggest lesson I learned from this first character is that mechanics matter. My first character was beyond suboptimal. They were virtually unplayable, and that directly led to me not enjoying my time playing that character. Like I said at the beginning of this video, the situation is contextual. I can totally see other tables building characters with the approach that I built mine, and if all of the players are building characters like that and the power level is even, I could see the players having a lot of fun with that. Or let's say the campaign isn't as combat focused. There may be ways that my 1 level dip into sorcerer would result in some clever spells or something that don't really require a lot of rolls, that would allow them to feel like a meaningful participant in the story. It's just that in this case, because there was a little bit more of a focus in combat, and the other players had a different approach to their character creation, I ended up being the weakest character in the party by far. And it really didn't feel like my mechanics matched the story that I wanted to tell. After a discussion with my GM, we mutually agreed to retire my first character that was underperforming. And instead, I was given the opportunity of creating a brand new character starting at 9th level. Now at this point, I'd been playing this campaign for about a year, and I had started GMing my own campaign at home for about 6 months. One of my friends in that home campaign was playing a Sorlock, a build that he had found online that was optimized. And having had experience of seeing the effectiveness of a Sorlock on the GM side of the screen, I decided to try a similar build with my new character. Rather than picking options that made sense story-wise, I made choices that were mechanically powerful. And man, my experience completely flipped. I had a blast with this character. Literally. Turn by turn, I often would use my action to cast an agonizing Eldritch Blast. Because I was 9th level, I got 2 beams, but I also had Quicken spell from Sorcerer, which allowed me to cast one of my leveled spells as a bonus action. I had this very adaptable action economy, along with some very powerful spells that led to some memorable standout moments. And I finally felt free from having to negotiate how all my mechanics worked. I could just read from the book. That creature has to make a dex save or has to make a constitution save. As a Sorlock, all of my casting was done through charisma, and so that freed me up to have a high constitution and decent dexterity score. I had solved all the problems I had experienced with my first character, and went from being the weakest player character in the party to arguably the strongest. Playing an optimized character was far more fun for me than playing a suboptimal character in this particular group. And when I think back on my experiences with that character, especially in the context of some of the experiences I've had since, that character ended up being shallow. Again, I had a lot of fun at the time, but it's kind of like an ice cream cone. Yeah, it can be a fun treat, it can be tasty in the moment, but it's not satiating for any length of time. There's actually a point in the campaign when the GM introduced an NPC to my character, and it was an NPC I'd written as part of my character's backstory. As the player, I just had completely forgot, and so much so that I ended up ignoring the NPC and failing to live up to a potentially cool story moment. Once the campaign concluded, I realized I had missed the entire point of why I wanted to play TTRPGs in the first place. It was the mechanics relationship with storytelling, not just mechanics for mechanics' sake. Now that being said, after that first year of play with my first character, I was really discouraged and I was thinking about not playing anymore. Playing this optimized Sorlock was so much fun that it encouraged me to keep going, and was eventually the gateway experience that led to some of the more meaningful moments I had playing TTRPGs. The lesson I learned here is that yes, the mechanics matter, and it's the storytelling that sets TTRPGs apart from any other kind of gaming medium. The experience will be unsatisfactory in the long term if you don't have both of those elements considered. So, it's the summer of 2018. It was just under 2 years of starting to play D&D regularly at the center when I was invited to a new 21 and up campaign that featured a lot more mature storytelling elements. I had learned a lot about the game's mechanics. I had a pretty good idea of the tone the GM wanted to hit. It was going to be darker, feature a lot more political intrigue. And ultimately, to match that tone, I decided to try to build another Witcher character, like my first character I'd retired. Now, to give myself a little bit of grace, during my first attempt, I only had the material from the 2014 Player's Handbook. I built that character a year before Xanathar's Guide was even released. And Sword Coast Adventurer's Guide wasn't on our radar and probably wouldn't have made a difference anyway. So, Knowing what I knew now, I had a completely different approach building this character than my first two. Rather than having a story-only approach like I did with my first character, or a mechanics-only approach like I did with my second character, I started with a clear story vision and researched all of the different features of classes and subclasses, picking out the mechanics separated from their flavor that would allow me to tell the story I wanted by reshaping the flavor around those mechanics. Again, the two skills I really valued out of this character were nature and survival. And rather than have those skills tied to a specific favored enemy or favored terrain, I wanted my character to just be good at them. So after all my research, I finally ended up settling on Scout Rogue, which as part of that subclass automatically gets expertise in nature and survival. Rogue, the description, didn't match at all story-wise what I wanted from my character. But looking at the mobility features like cunning action, the precision required for sneak attack, from a gameplay perspective, I could see those mechanics with a little bit of the serial numbers filed off, fitting the story I wanted to tell. And by level 3, this character had a +7 bonus to insight, perception, survival, and a +5 to nature. Now what's really interesting is this is the character that I have the most fond memories playing. Not only was he fun to play mechanically, his story was probably the deepest of any character I've ever played since, and a lot of the other players considered him optimized, which is interesting because outside of this campaign I'm talking about, I've brought that build to a lot of other tables. And combat-wise, he performs all right. Even in this campaign, I was thinking about the different builds other players brought. One player was playing this really creative Bear Totem Barbarian Rogue multiclass, which combined some of the features like Uncanny Dodge and Evasion with Bear Totem Rage, and man, I haven't seen a more effective tanking build since. There was a player that was using a homebrew blood magic subclass for their sorcerer, and again, in terms of raw damage dealing potential, I don't think any of us could match that character. And then, of course, there was another player using Matt Mercer's Gunslinger Fighter subclass, with, again, some adjustments and some custom equipment. Again, they were an awesome damage dealer, and really contributed in some niche situations that I'm not sure we would have gotten out of without them. Even with all this considered, some of those same players were still giving me sarcastic comments about, man, your character's the most optimized. Why? Because in this game, combat was rare and wasn't the point. Sure, the combats were deadly and difficult, but 90% of the gameplay was social interaction. And the most common ability checks that were called for were, you guessed it, insight and perception. We were constantly rolling perception checks to see if we noticed some waiter or server that was a spy in disguise, moving sneakily around the gala floor, or interpreting a politician's body language with insight checks. Yes, those other characters I mentioned were optimized for combat, but a sorcerer and fighter, even if they built for wisdom, which I don't think they did, maybe had like a +4 or a +5 to those checks. Whereas again, because I had expertise, I was doubling my proficiency bonus on top of having prioritized wisdom. So yeah, by the end of the game, my passive perception was like a 32 because I also took the observant feat. Another thing to mention in this particular campaign setting is there was an understanding that most magic was outlawed. So whereas an optimizing channel like Treant Monk may say like, oh, you know, skill bonuses can be replaced by spells, and that's why spellcasters are so much more powerful. Well, the context of this particular setting was different, and it just so happened that, yes, my character was optimized to succeed at die rolls that this GM particularly called for more often than others. One lesson takeaway I have from playing this character is that optimization is relative. In a political intrigue game where most of the die rolls are insight and perception checks, having a character with high wisdom and expertise in insight and perception is more optimal than having one of the best tanking builds I've ever played alongside. However, there's another way to look at optimization. Rather than a character's peak mechanical performance, squeaking out every point of damage or every armor class point, another way that I learned to look at it is through table dynamics. That table's culture wasn't really about optimization. In fact, I would say a soft majority of the players valued the random die rolls and failing more often than I was comfortable with at the time. By almost always succeeding the die rolls I was asked for, I was kind of trespassing on the dark nature of the world. Things weren't as dangerous, because my character would see them coming before anyone else. So rather than thinking, what's my character's peak mechanical performance, one thing that I started to look at with this character was how well their build meshed with the party, and the preferences of the real-world players behind the characters. Now, before moving on, one thing I will freely establish is I am definitely not an anti-optimizer. I never go out of my way to create an underpowered character, especially with my bad first experience with my first character. My current approach to creating characters is having some kind of storytelling depth combined with mechanics that I think will be fun to play at the table. However, as with this tale, I will also fully acknowledge that hardcore optimization can definitely present problems at your table. I was a player in a new campaign, and we were all told to just bring third-level characters. None of us knew what characters we were bringing until we sat down at the table with each other. Thinking back to the characters I had previously had fun with, I had a lot of fun building a Sorlock and a Scout Rogue, both of which, from a combat perspective, were focused mostly on damage dealing. So, to try something new, I decided to build a support character, and one that had always intrigued me was Druid. The reason being, there was a lot of buzz online about one of the spells in particular from Xanathar's Guide to Everything, Healing Spirit. You see, nowadays, if you were to go out and pick up a copy of Xanathar's Guide to Everything, most likely what Healing Spirit would say is that it creates this intangible spirit within a 5-foot cube. If you or a creature of your choice moves through that cube or starts your turn there, with no action, you can choose to heal them 1d6 hit points. As a bonus action, you can even move the cube around a little bit. But the key thing is that after you've healed creatures a number of times equal to 1 plus your spell casting ability modifier, in this case, Wisdom, the spirit disappears. Back when I created this character, that last bit, the limited number of uses, wasn't part of the spell. That errata was added later because Healing Spirit was so powerful, and that was the part that intrigued me. I wanted to see how it would actually work at the table. So I built my level 3 druid with old school overpowered Healing Spirit and showed up to the table. The characters that the other players brought were 2 rogues, a fighter, a paladin, and a cleric. We go through a few combats, some, minion skirmishes, and already I'm having a blast. As a druid, one of the first things I did in one of the earlier combats was cast Entangle, which restrained some of the targets for the rogues to trigger sneak attack. As someone who had just played a scout rogue, I had experienced many times the frustration of an ally not setting up sneak attack even after I explained how it worked. So anyway, I felt really good about being able to set up my rogue allies for success. We get to the big final fight of the session. There was one big bruiser type and a bunch of minions scattered around the battlefield. Now, the way the terrain broke down, the 2 rogues and the fighter ended up separated from the rest of us. The paladin and the cleric ended up adjacent to the big bruiser boss monster, while my druid was between 20 and 30 feet away from them. Here's where things got tense. After a round or 2 of combat, the bruiser hits the paladin, and the paladin dropped to 0 and fell right down. From my memory, I think I was next, followed by the cleric. Again, this was years ago, and my memory could be fuzzy. But seeing that the paladin went down, I used a bonus action to cast my Healing Spirit. The cleric player didn't really understand how Healing Spirit worked, so I explained to them. Based on what was happening in the rest of the encounter, my Healing Spirit would heal the paladin on their turn. The paladin would be able to stand up, hit the big bruiser with a divine smite, and based on the action economy, the big bruiser would hit the paladin would drop down, and because the rogue and fighters were keeping the minions off of them, my healing spirit would just let the paladin stand up. And I was pretty confident that within 10 rounds, we'd be able to whittle down this boss monster. The cleric player, I remember just looking really dejected and just saying to me, well, what do I do now? And I just said, well, you can use your other spells, you can cast buffs on the other characters. And they said, but I'm the cleric. I'm supposed to be the healer. I didn't realize it at the time because we didn't have any prior communication, but this player built a life cleric and only took healing spells, which was a choice I had just negated with Healing Spirit. And at the time we agreed, based on Healing Spirit's mechanics, it would be way riskier to not have the Healing Spirit just heal that paladin on repeat. And for the rest of the fight, it pretty much happened the way I had mapped it out. Unfortunately, on the cleric's turn, all they could do was make a weapon attack. And they weren't built with weapon attacks in mind, so they mostly just swung and missed and ended their turn. Basically, they had an experience very similar to what I had with my first character, feeling very underpowered and like they couldn't contribute. After that session, that player retired their cleric. They're like, well, if the druid can just do my entire job with one bonus action and spell slot, I should bring something different. And they ended up making a different character and having a lot more fun playing a marshal. But still, it stuck out to me that because one option was so powerful, it basically took away the value of another character's entire build. Optimization was a problem because of a lack of communication about our expectations of the game, our character builds, which is why I know some tables kind of like the approach of bring whatever you want and we'll make the story happen. And in my experience, that has never really worked. It's just that some campaigns were less disastrous than others, and the ones that did end really badly far outnumber the ones that didn't. To drive this point home, I actually have a counter example from the same campaign. Another player joined midway through at 6th level, and they had also brought a cleric. So knowing ahead of time they were joining, I messaged them in private and said, hey, here's a heads up. If you're planning on building a cleric as a healer, I would pick other spells as well. And we'll do this based on context and initiative order. If your cleric can heal first and get out a healing word to save an ally, that's awesome. Let's go with that instead. If, however, my turn comes up, I'm going to use Healing Spirit, especially if multiple party members are going down, and I can move my Healing Spirit to heal them as needed. The other player and I agreed on this strategy, and we showed up to the session. Well, the big final fight was against a counter party. There was a party of equal-leveled player characters that almost were a mirror to us. The way initiative broke down, my druid opened with plant growth, and then the cleric went and casted silence. Because we communicated ahead of time the whole healing thing and just making sure to prep other spells, the way it worked out is that this counterparty got stuck in the plant growth and in the zone of silence. Almost all of the members of the counterparty were spellcasters, and they couldn't move out of the zone of silence faster than we could just shoot them with arrows from afar. It was a great moment of teamwork and a great way to show how with some communication we both had semi-optimized characters and we ended up better than being optimized alone. When it comes to optimization, sometimes we end up thinking of our characters as silos instead of how our mechanics can synergize with another character's mechanics to create an even better result. For my final tale, I will talk about the latest character that I'm playing in an ongoing campaign. This character just hit level 7. They're 6 levels of Sword Bard and 1 level of Hexblade Warlock. Now, I can imagine A lot of you may be hearing that and being like, oh, I can already imagine what that character sheet must look like. There's a medium armor and shield proficiency. This character has a breastplate and a shield, so they have an AC of 18. Their attack and spellcasting is both governed by charisma. Even though that particular class combination is optimized, when it came to my spell selection, I kind of went out of my way not to choose the most powerful options. Oh, there are some powerful options, let me tell you. But a lot of the spells are mostly situational. And that's because one of the things I learned over time is that oftentimes we speak about optimization in two extremes, in two binary outcomes. Either my character is optimized or is not optimized. Whereas I find the most enjoyment figuring out a table's level of optimization. Again, the most enjoyable character I've ever played was the one from Tale number 3. And at the end of the day, while they were highly optimized for that specific campaign setting, they end up not being super optimized in the context of most D&D groups. But their mechanics serve as tools to help me tell the story that I want, that of a highly perceptive, insightful monster hunter. And in this latest campaign, I wanted to play a carefree jester with a background as a knight, Sylvando from Dragon Quest XI. He's really fun to play because he isn't perfect. Yes, I took a level of Warlock, and I made sure not to take Eldritch Blast, because in my mind, if he's gonna have to fight and get dirty, he's gonna do so with a sword and shield. But most of the time, he'd rather sit back, maybe cast illusions or healing spells, and somehow support his allies so they can be the star of the show. That playstyle at the moment is optimal for me. It creates this ideal tension in the storytelling, where my spells aren't an instant win button, but they do allow me some clever solutions like that episode of Futurama. Best specific moment I can remember happened recently. We had a session where our party was tasked with finishing off this warrior from a village, and this warrior ended up being possessed by a spirit. But rather than just kill the warrior outright, I ended up having protection from evil and good from the warlock spell list. So I told my GM I might take some damage getting in range, and if I can get a hand on him and cast the spell, even though he's already possessed, can he at least start making some kind of save in order to purge the spirit? The GM was like, yeah. Now the spell says that he gets advantage, but because this is a special circumstance, I'm gonna say it's a straight roll. And because the warrior got possessed in the first place, I had a feeling that they didn't have a super strong charisma. As the fight went on, the warrior was making charisma saves, and one thing I noticed about Bardic Inspiration, all it targets is a creature, it doesn't have to be an ally. So I used my Bardic Inspiration on the warrior to try to motivate him to purge the spirit himself. And the GM was super cool and super flexible. And what ended up happening was this really unique story of a bard believing in a possessed warrior that he had the strength to purge this spirit. And he ended up succeeding enough times that yes, the spirit got exorcised. I got to use a spell in a creative way, but not as an instant win button. There was definitely this storytelling tension that was created, and it ended up having a cathartic outcome. To me, optimizing a character isn't just what are the numbers like. And even if it is, sometimes that's the kind of experience you and your table want. But for some of us that think that optimization can ruin storytelling, a lack of mechanics, in my experience, creates the same problem. So for me, when I personally create a character for a campaign now, I ask myself 3 big questions. First, mechanically, are the choices that I'm picking going to help me tell the story that I want? Second, is this character going to step on the toes of any other characters? And third, what are some reliable options I can pick for my character? A warlock, a reliable option would be Eldritch Blasting, and for a fighter, it would be their main weapon attack. But also, what are some neat situational or classically underpowered options that, if I give them to my character, may end up coming up in some creative situational circumstances? To me, this often creates an optimal experience at my table. So now, I want to hear from you. What are your feelings on optimization? Has it caused problems at tables you've been a part of, or do you see it as a feature of 5th edition D&D? And do you have your own tales to tell? Let me know in the comments down below. Hit like, subscribe, ring the notification bell, and remember, your story matters. Bye-bye now.